October 7th of 2016, the Washington Post released a video from 2005 in which presidential candidate Donald Trump bragged about how you can get away with sexually assaulting women if you're famous. That same day, Wikileaks released transcripts of 3 paid speeches given by presidential candidate Hillary Clinton to banking giant Goldman Sachs as part of a larger bundle of divulgences from the hacked personal Gmail account of her campaign chairman, John Podesta. These speeches were pretty controversial as they were very well paid. She earned $675,000 in speaking fees from Goldman for the appearances, and fellow Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders lambasted her for the apparent conflict of interest this payout implied. Also, on October 7th, 2016, mere hours before that tape was released and those talks were leaked, Trump publicly claimed that the Central Park Five, a group of black men who were wrongly convicted of assault and rape in 1989, and who were later exonerated by DNA evidence and a confession from the actual perpetrator, Trump claimed they were guilty, which was a silly and to some quite offensive thing to say, but also seemed to gesture at the candidate's ignorance, at minimum, and according to some responses to this statement at least, his possible racism as well. So October 7th of 2016 was a pretty big day in terms of political divulgences, and it's considered to be one of the most prominent modern aggregations of what are, in US politics, often called October surprises. The term October surprise was coined by former President Ronald Reagan's campaign manager during the run-up to the 1980 presidential election, in reference to fears that a last-minute deal negotiated by incumbent president and Reagan's competitor in the race, Jimmy Carter, to get American hostages in Iran freed could net Carter enough votes to win re-election, despite many other variables operating against him. News reports were abuzz over these negotiations, so the narrative leaning in the president's favor could tilt things against Reagan, and his campaign manager was thus concerned that this bit of news, which was outside of his control, part of a spiral of larger events, would drop like a bomb on his campaign maneuverings, upending everything and completely changing the nature of the race if it were to happen. That ended up not being the case, as Iran's leaders eventually notified their counterparts in the US that they would not be releasing anyone until after the election. But this sort of last-minute narrative change-up had occurred in US elections before, including then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger saying at a press conference that he believed the Vietnam War would end soon, just 12 days before the 1972 election, which is thought to have helped Nixon win another term in office. And also, on October 7th, but in 1964, one of then-President Johnson's top aides was arrested for engaging in homosexual acts with another man at a DC YMCA, which seemed likely to tip the scales against his campaign, as that was a big no-no at the time. But then, just a week later, hardliners in the Soviet Union booted Nikita Khrushchev from power, the Labour Party narrowly took over the UK government, and China conducted its first nuclear weapons test, all of which pushed the YMCA incident from the news and rebalanced the election in various ways once more. These sorts of last-minute surprises, last-minute because US presidential elections occur in early November, and these things seem to land like clockwork sometime in October, give or take a week, abound throughout US history. And though they usually only have a small or moderate impact on the final vote, in some cases they have been so dramatic and surprising or paradigm-shifting that they've completely upended expectations and seemingly changed the course of history. What I'd like to talk about today are 2 recent narrative change-ups in the ongoing US election, which will culminate with a vote this November, both of which have the potential to dramatically influence the outcome of the election and who ultimately occupies the White House beginning next year. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Learn more about Let's Know Things, subscribe to receive free email updates, and or become a supporter to receive monthly bonus episodes at letsknowthings.com. It feels like I've been doing a lot of US-centric news lately, and though that's not intentional, and it's a trend I intend to defy in the coming weeks, there have been two potentially historic storylines playing out in US politics in recent weeks that I believe justify explanation and analysis, in part because they are so historic and unusual, and in part because they seem likely to define the narrative of the presidential race over the next 100 days or so between now and the November 5th vote. Of course, I say that, knowing full well I could end up eating crow, acting today as if these are defining moments, when in reality either more dramatic and seemingly historic stuff could happen in the next 3 months-ish, or these moments could be set aside and largely forgotten in mere weeks, voter attention refocused on other things, like the actual policies being proposed by the two major parties in this race. There are good arguments for both eventualities, as the communication environment in which this election is playing out is novel in many ways, and the people involved and the things they stand for, and the larger global context in which they are operating, are also quite bizarre by historical standards. So these two stories are, I think, important to understand, as they could shape the path the rest of the race takes, and the moves both Republicans and Democrats up and down the ballot make in the coming months, which in turn will influence happenings globally in all sorts of important ways. But it can also be that life takes over, other stuff takes precedent, and folks mostly just vote along party lines, as has tended to be increasingly the case these past handful of elections. We will see how that goes. In the meantime, though, let's talk about the apparent attempted assassination of former president and current presidential candidate Donald Trump, and the seeming deterioration of current President Joe Biden's mental and physical health, the resultant calls from within his own party for him to step aside and let someone else run in his stead, and the decision he announced just a few days ago to step aside and let his party select a new candidate. On July 13th of this year, 2024, Trump was at a campaign tour stop in Butler, Pennsylvania, up on stage presenting his speech when a 20-year-old man named Thomas Crooks shot at him, firing 8 rounds from an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle from a rooftop about 400 feet, which is about 120 meters away from the stage. One of the bullets seemed to clip Trump's ear, and others hit members of the audience, one of whom was killed, and 2 others were critically wounded. A Secret Service sniper killed Crooks right after he took those shots, and Trump was surrounded by Secret Service agents moments after he was hit, briefly emerging from their huddle to raise his fist and shout, "Fight, fight, fight," before being hustled away from the stage. Some of the photos of the shooting and the aftermath quickly became famous, and a few of them are already considered to be historic, including several that showed Trump still bloody, pumping his fist, seemingly defiant and even victorious from within the protective embrace of his Secret Service team, an American flag waving in the background. Even commentators who do not like Trump have publicly said he looks pretty badass in these photos. And that general sense of badassery has been played up by the Trump campaign since the shooting. The Republican National Convention was just days after that campaign stop, and several attendees wore fake ear bandages, mimicking the one worn by the former president. And many political analysts went ahead and called the election for Trump, citing the significance of surviving an assassination attempt, especially during a race between 2 elderly men, both of whom have been struggling to demonstrate their youthful vigor and favorably contrast themselves to their opponent. In the wake of the shooting, several big-name donors committed money to Trump's campaign, including Tesla and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk, and an array of Silicon Valley bigwigs, like the founders of Andreessen Horowitz, which is the most prominent venture capital firm in California. This wave of new support from big donors and small allowed Trump to outraise Biden for the month for the first time in this election cycle. The campaign also signaled it may lean into a unity message rather than what's become Trump's more combative, aggressive tact, which seemed likely to help him scoop up some on-the-fence voters and possibly even some centrist Democrats who were increasingly concerned about Biden as the face of their party, though at the RNC event, Trump named further-right Ohio senator and author of best-selling book Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance, as his vice president, which is being seen as a doubling down on aggression, not a balancing, moderating move on Trump's part. And the scripted unity speech he gave, which used a lot of religious, Jesus rising from the dead type language, alongside some gestures at the country coming together in the wake of violence, pretty quickly derailed into a somewhat rambling series of attacks against Trump's perceived enemies. So that approach, at least for the moment, is not being seen as a serious path for Trump and his team. On the other side of the political fence, current President Biden has long faced calls to step down, mostly because of his advanced age and what that age portends. He is already 81 years old, and he will be 82 in late November, shortly after the upcoming election. People are living longer these days and enjoying more of those years healthfully and productively, but Biden has had a speech impediment his entire life, which as an older man has at times made it seem like he's not as with it as his fellow candidates, fairly or unfairly, and the frictions and scars of simply having lived a long, long time seem to be catching up with him as well. And some fairly high-profile stumbles and misspeakings, alongside caught-on-camera missteps and other signs of age and possible not wellness, have amplified calls for him to step aside and allow someone younger to lead the Democrats' ticket in November. These calls were a not insignificant component of his opponent's campaign in the 2020 election, but they ticked up several notches following what's generally considered to be a disastrous debate for Biden in late June of this year. The debate rules were, in some ways, stacked in Biden's favor, as there would not be a studio audience for Trump to play off of, which is considered to be a strength of his debate style, and the candidates' microphones would be muted when it wasn't their turn to speak, which was meant to help temper Trump's tendency to go way over time and to speak over his opponent. Despite those seeming advantages, though, from the moment he walked onto the debate stage, Biden looked and seemed unwell. His face was kind of drooping, his eyes looked uncanny and surprised, his words seemed to tumble over each other, not in his typical fashion, influenced by his speech impediment, but in a confused, rambling, at times disjointed, and not well-seeming way. Even diehard supporters of Biden began to question his ability to serve another term following that debate. And while most analysts pointed out that Trump's statements were riddled with lies, he did present those lies mostly intelligibly, while Biden, though mostly sticking to the truth, had trouble communicating much of anything, his delivery and overall visage suggesting that he is not okay. And if that's where he is now, where will he be in another several months, much less several years, if he were to take office for another 4? Those long-simmering concerns about his age surged into a full-on roiling boil from that point forward, and higher-ups in the Democratic Party started to call for Biden to step aside, some of them probably due to concerns about their own races, his unpopularity, which was ticking upward according to recent polls, impacting their electoral outlook, and others because they worried about Trump being elected, not on his own strengths necessarily, but because Biden had become toxic due to his stumbles, and the general and seemingly growing sense that he is just not up to the job anymore because of the impacts of age. As of the morning of Sunday, July 21st, 39 Democratic congresspeople had overtly called for Biden to drop out, 23 had publicly expressed concerns about Biden, which is a lighter weight way to say the same, basically, and 7 had said it's Biden's choice. Though to be clear, Biden had said he's not dropping out over and over again at that point. So the folks who said it's his choice following that clear declaration seemed to be, in some cases at least, playing both sides as they were stating their support for him while leaving the door open for him to change his mind at some point in the future. 57 congresspeople, in contrast, were saying Biden should stay in the race, which is fewer than had said he should drop out, overtly or subtly, though a lot of people were apparently expressing concerns behind closed doors, and the wave of anonymous sources talking to reporters on the matter, telling stories about his various fumbles and their election-related worries, reinforced the supposition that there were more people hoping he would step back than not, including a lot of top-tier donors, It's just that many of them were concerned about their role within the party if they expressed those concerns publicly. Then, in the early afternoon that same day, Biden's team released a statement from the president saying that he would be withdrawing from the 2024 election, followed shortly thereafter by a message indicating he was endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him. Biden is apparently sick with COVID at the moment and is expected to speak on the matter sometime this week, once he's able to do so without coughing and rasping. But it's possible this news was released in this way, in writing, rather than live and on camera, because it was just a truly difficult decision for someone who, according to his political career and bio, or the public-facing versions of those things presented by his campaign at least, tended to focus on sticking it out and persevering when faced with doubters, which in this case would have meant holding out and remaining the Democratic candidate despite all those factors working against him. This represents an historic shift in the election, though, as no U.S. presidential candidate has ever dropped out this close to the vote, and he is the first to ever drop out after winning his party's primaries. What happens now is thus up in the air, but the outline being shared by Democratic leaders as of the day I'm recording this seems to be that they will hold some kind of lightning-fast election to see who replaces Biden on the ticket, possibly as part of an effort to avoid the mistake they made with Hillary Clinton, party higher-ups pushing too hard to favor one of their own, whose turn they basically believe it is to take that role, over the candidates that the voters actually wanted, though there's only about a month in which to figure out what that looks like, to set it up, to allow folks to decide to run and figure out campaign strategies, and then to actually hold a vote, which is a lot. And that process could be chaotic, and it could result in fracturing within the Democratic Party, as folks might go negative against each other, despite guidelines telling them not to, and voters might not like it if their chosen person doesn't win, and they are then told to cast their lot in the actual presidential election for someone they voted against in this mini lightning-fast pseudo-primary. At the moment, current Vice President Harris seems to have the lion's share of her party's support. As of the day I'm recording this, 179 Democratic leaders out of 286 congresspeople and governors have publicly endorsed her candidacy, alongside other big names in the party like the Clintons and prominent former presidential candidates like current Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who, in addition to still being influential with a large portion of the base, was also considered to be one of the people who might run against her. And that has been the case with several other could-be candidates who have instead decided to publicly endorse Harris. Right now, though, it is a big unknown who will ultimately take up the mantle of the Democratic Party's presidential electee. And that makes things more difficult for the Democrats because of those aforementioned potential issues with unity and clarity. But it also makes things trickier for the Trump campaign, as they cannot be certain who they are running against. And some reports suggest the whole campaign has been optimized to compete with Biden. Whereas now, Trump is the oldest ever presidential candidate for a major U.S. political party, and many of the criticisms they were planning to level against Biden can now be leveled against him instead. The assassination attempt on Trump is still a variable here too, as it seems to have rallied Republicans around him in a big way, but whether or not that will translate to larger support beyond existing diehards is a big question mark. Important to note, too, is that while assassination attempts of presidents in the U.S. are rare in modern history, thankfully, so we don't have a ton of data as to how they influence election outcomes, the assumed consequence of this one, namely supporting Trump's election bid, might not be the outcome that we actually get. The attempted killing of President Reagan in 1981 seems to have bumped his numbers about 8% in the months immediately following the event. But earlier assassination attempts of former President Teddy Roosevelt and George Wallace did not win them their bids for the office. And the larger context of the election and the would-be electee seems to matter more statistically than the attempt when it comes to polling changes. Similarly, it may be that the Democrats are able to leverage Biden's decision to drop out, and the elevation of someone else from their party to the position of would-be president could help drive a new, exciting narrative, that of a veteran statesman stepping down for the good of his party and the country, and new, younger blood taking up that mantle, fighting against another member of the old guard who himself would never consider doing the same, stepping down. It's also important to remember, though, as I mentioned earlier, that this is all happening months before the election. And there's a chance these won't be the most important and dramatic stories shaping the narrative by the time we reach November, hard as it might be to believe now. These July surprises could be replaced by August surprises, September surprises, and the classic October surprises, which could then upend the table once more, leaving everything chaotic and confusing right before votes are cast. So while these seem like very big deals at the moment, and they are dominating headlines and will almost certainly be historically relevant, we may be in for a lot more planned and unplanned election-impacting divulgences and happenings in the months to come. The book I'd like to recommend today is called The Day the World Stops Shopping: How Ending Consumerism Saves the Environment and Ourselves by J.B. MacKinnon. This book explores what's essentially a thought experiment, asking the question of what would happen if we reduced our consumption substantially, but not to such a degree that no one's ever buying anything. So what if we cut back maybe 25% of our current volume of global consumption? What would that look like? And so he travels around to talk to folks in different areas that consume at different rates, looks at case studies that suggest what we might expect if such a thing were to happen, and then explains some of the benefits that we might enjoy if we were to figure out a way to make that kind of consumption reduction actually occur. If any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of The Day the World Stops Shopping by J.B. MacKinnon. You can subscribe to receive email updates, find show notes, and other such content, and support this show financially, receiving additional bonus episodes as a thank you at letsknowthings.com. Learn more about me and my work at Colin.io. Subscribe to my other news-focused podcast, One Sentence News, wherever you get your pods, or at onesentencenews.com. And say howdy on social media. I'm at Colin is my name on Instagram and Twitter, and Colin Wright on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.